Welcome in, guys. Another disappointed result this weekend for the Purdue Boilermakers as they fall to Wisconsin 38-17 in Ross-Ade Stadium on Friday night. And yeah, I can already tell you that this is not going to be a long one. I wrote up some notes for this one, but I don't think there's really a whole lot we're going to really say. We'll talk quickly about Wisconsin. We'll take a look around the Big Ten, and then we'll take a We'll take a little bit of a break this week before we come back in the next episode, taking a look at the Illinois Fighting Illini in that one. But starting with Wisconsin, I mean, this one I think started about as poorly as you could imagine. Purdue ends up going down 14-0 relatively quickly. And of course, by relatively quickly, I mean relatively very quickly. Purdue goes 3 and out on their first opening offensive possession. Wisconsin marches down the field 62 yards in 3.5 minutes to go up 7-0. Purdue offense really struggling to get going even from there. And then Wisconsin scores again towards the end of the first quarter to go up 14-0. Purdue does put in a field goal in the first quarter, and that was all of the scoring Purdue would do in the first half. As even in the second quarter, Wisconsin put in one touchdown in the second quarter to go into the half up 21-3. And while Purdue did show some fight down the stretch, there really was nothing that Purdue could really do, as Wisconsin kind of held them at arm's length. The closest they got was 27-17 late in the third quarter, as Hudson Card ran in a touchdown to put us down 10. A Wisconsin field goal at the beginning of the fourth quarter put them up 30-17. Purdue had an opportunity to cut it closer than that even still, but was not to do. And then towards the end of the game, Wisconsin puts another touchdown on our heads to go up 38-17 for the final margin. Well, I guess we'll just start right there. The final margin, I have no problem with Wisconsin running up the score. They want to make a statement, and, they marched into Ross-Ade Stadium on a Friday night, and they put 38 points on our head, and I have no problem with that, really. It's not like they ran a play right, at the buzzer. They had, 4 minutes left when they ended up scoring, and so I have no real quarrels with that outside of just the ire of it being Wisconsin. That was the one ending up doing it, and so it was a tough night. It was a tough night for us, and I think thankfully, whether we appreciated it or not, having one extra day to kind of cool down from this might do us all a little bit of good. But if we move on now to start and look at the stats, we'll go ahead and start with Wisconsin, just because they did end up pretty much dominating in this one. Tanner Mordecai didn't really do anything too special through the air, threw for 174 yards and an interception, and added 44 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. The rushing game really was the story, as it always seems to be for Wisconsin. Braylon Allen rushes for 116 yards and 2 touchdowns. Tanner Mordecai puts on 44 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. Ches Malusi also, I think, would have been a bigger impact here. He ended up with 39 yards, but he actually ended up taking a pretty nasty injury in this one and had to leave the game. So hopefully he is able to recover. It looked really bad. I don't know if I haven't seen anything since, but it was pretty nasty stuff. So that's never something you want to see, even if it is from a conference rival. So hopefully he's able to recover and get back on the field, because that guy has been doing pretty well this year. In the receiving game, I mean, like I said, Mordecai threw for 174 yards. They ended up throwing for 193 yards total. So it's not even like Wisconsin was too dominant on offense stats-wise. I think it was just the inefficiency of the Purdue defense to get off the field and get those stops that really doomed us here. No receiving touchdowns, obviously, like I said. Kamara Dyke ends up leading Wisconsin, 3 receptions for 67 yards. CJ Williams pretty close behind with 56 on 5 receptions. So a pretty balanced day for Wisconsin. I mean, there's not really a whole lot to really even say there. I mean, not really a whole lot you can't say. Like I said at the top, there's not. I mean, we're gonna talk about the stats, and we're just gonna kind of forget this one and move on. Looking at the Purdue side, Hudson Card throws for 200 yards and a couple of interceptions. On the ground, Tyrone Tracy led the way at 84 yards on 8 carries and a touchdown. Hudson Card providing the other Purdue touchdown on the ground, like I mentioned later in the third quarter. He ran for 54 total. Jalen Downing got a handful of snaps for 30 yards, and Devin Mockbee really struggled in this one for only 26 yards on 4 carries. I don't know what's going on with Devin. I don't know if it's... I don't know. I really don't know. But I would love to see this guy get going. Again, what we saw last year, I think, is really just scratching the surface of what he can be as a running back. But right now, it just seems like Tyrone Tracy Jr. is the guy to make the plays happen on the ground. And so I'm glad that we have both of them, but I would love to see Devin kind of get it back under himself and get back to doing what we know that he can. In the receiving game, Deion Burks leads the way with 6 receptions, 73 yards. Abdur Rahman Yassin, 4 for 62. TJ Sheffield also getting there, 3 for 39. This was just an odd day, I think. Let's just put it out there. This was a game where Purdue was never clicking really on either side of the ball. It wasn't until later in the second half, about midway through the second half, that Purdue really kind of started to arrive offensively, and I think that also was just the fact that Wisconsin was, playing ahead for the entire game, and so maybe there was just some defensive lapses on there. But we lose 2 fumbles, or we put 2 fumbles out there, Hudson Card and Devin Mockbee. Although the Mockbee fumble is obviously a point of contention when it comes to it, but the stats don't lie. I mean, we can talk about the refs, and I don't want to be the guy who goes, the refs in this one. And while they were very poor, you can't always put everything on the refs, and Purdue just didn't play well enough to beat Wisconsin. As much as that is a pain, and as much as we don't want to accept that it really was just a very, very poor... It was just a poor showing from Purdue all over. And I think the biggest disappointment, might have been the turnovers. I mean, after going for the first 2 games of the season, where Purdue had 0 turnovers, in the last couple of games, it's been 4 or 5 turnovers against Syracuse, and then another 3 turnovers here against Wisconsin. And a couple of them, or one of them, the fumble by Mockbee, obviously, I don't think it actually was a fumble. The 2 interceptions by Card, one of which was particularly egregious, is kind of tough to see as we moved into the bulk of Purdue's schedule here going forward. But it is what it is. I kind of moved into my bullet points a little early. Let's just continue on. On defense, Kajan Jenkins led the way, along with Sanusi Kane with 9 tackles each. A couple of 3 total tackles for losses between both of them as well. I think all in all, I mean, this was tough. Purdue does get 1 takeaway. Botros Alessandro gets his first career interception in this one, which was very exciting to see. I love seeing guys get their first takeaway of their career, and it was, I think it was badly needed at that point. I mean, Purdue needed everything that they could get at that point, and while it didn't really amount to anything, it was it gave us a bit of a spark, and those are the kind of things that you always want to look for. Seeing these guys not quit and just fighting until the end. And while the final score looks a bit rough, and it was a bit rough, I'm glad to see that these guys aren't. They're playing till the whistle, and at this point, that's all you can really ask for. But, I mean, we can look at the stats all day long. It is what it is. Purdue loses to Wisconsin for the 17th time in a row. There's really only so much you can say about it at this point. At this point, I think we'll just move on to the next sort of half topic I had, which is really just what this year is now going to look like for Purdue football. I've definitely not resigned myself to Purdue being a one-win team again. I do think there are still games. I put this out on Twitter and Threads earlier this week on Saturday. I believe it was the different games that were remaining on Purdue's schedule, and their different categories that I would put them in. And so kind of looking over that, I think that's actually a very interesting sort of thing as we continue on, as we've seen a lot of the Big Ten's first games. Here's what I put on my socials for what I see as Purdue's remaining games. In a winnable category, I put Illinois, home against Illinois, at Northwestern, home against Minnesota, and home against Indiana. I think Illinois looks extremely nonplussed, taking on Florida Atlantic. They ended up walking out with a win. We'll go into their results more in the next segment. But I think Illinois looked beatable. I'm glad that game is at home. I don't think they'll prove the same issues and mismatches that Wisconsin always seems to be able to. At Northwestern has gotten a little spicy, as we did see Northwestern come back to beat Minnesota Over the weekend, it looked like Minnesota was going to run away with it before Northwestern kind of turned it on. And whatever happened to Minnesota, PJ Fleck has got to be trying to figure it out as fast as possible. The next team, obviously, also Minnesota. And Minnesota is actually a Jeff Sims not playing away from potentially being winless on the year. And so things are just not going well in Fleckland. And Minnesota has a lot of things they need to get figured out. But I think that also a game I'm glad is at home. And then obviously Indiana, who took 4 overtimes to beat Akron in their blackout game as they tried to take down the mighty Zips. And so those 4 games I do see as very winnable. I did put a probably not, but maybe as at Nebraska. Nebraska has been a lot less formidable at the beginning part of this year. Although when they did replace Jeff Sims with, I can't remember his name, but their second quarterback, which they played against Louisiana Tech, he obviously, I think he proves to be probably their starting quarterback going forward. And so I think that this spot definitely feels right for at Nebraska. I know there's a lot of people online who are kind of penciling that in as like Purdue should really win that game. But it's hard to win on the road, and especially at a Nebraska team that will probably be a little bit more put together than we've seen so far. And then in a likely not category, at Iowa, I mean, Iowa's defense, and while their offense may not be as good as they need them to be to really dominate, their defense will be more than enough, I think, to handle Purdue's offense this season. And while Purdue has had Iowa's number the last few years, it's tough to see going into Iowa City this year and taking down Iowa. And then finally, our definitely not category, Michigan and Ohio State. I think Purdue has plenty of opportunity to still put wins on the board this year. And that brings me to my next point, segue, seamless, really. And that is, there's been a lot of discussion also about Tom Fornelli on Twitter also pegged it perfectly, saying that Purdue just needs these dudes on defense to run this defensive system that Ryan Walters has installed. And I think that's the biggest thing that we've come to terms with as we've gone through 4 games so far this season, is that Ryan Walters has put his system in place, and the guys that he's currently has running in it, I think we're just either not recruited to play that system or just not the guys that we need right now to run that system to quite the effectiveness that it is. And the biggest discussion point is, should Ryan Walters put his system in place and struggle, or try and mold the system to match the personnel he has now? I lean more towards the side of put your system in place, put it on paper, and then you go out to recruits or people in the transfer portal and say, this is our system. You recruit player XYZ. I think you'll fit in this system perfectly. They'll be able to go and watch their tape and determine whether they fit in that system. And going forward, I think Purdue has a lot of dudes that are going to come in through recruiting next year. They have a top 30 class coming in. And when you look at the recruiting classes of the last few years of the Jeff Brom era and West Lafayette, you can see that it definitely left a lot to be desired, especially in depth and playmaking ability. And so I think starting next year, in the next few years, as Ryan Walters gets his guys in to come and run his system, I think we'll see a Purdue team that is very, very different and on defense as well as on offense than we're seeing right now. And so we've now transitioned into we're definitely not giving up on this year. I mean, I see Purdue still winning a few more games, but I mean, this is probably going to be, you're looking at this point, maybe a 4-8. If you're probably best case scenario, 5-7. The way that it's going to currently keep going, but it also could turn out to be unfortunately, the 3-9 season as well. I mean, it really is just going to kind of determine on which team comes out per week. And so that we're going to take our lumps this year, both as a team and as fans. But I, for one, I put this out, I think, to the chagrin of a lot of people online as well, after each game, where I'll say that even in the bad, I saw plenty of good things, and the potential is there. It's just the results are not going to come this year, and they're for sure not coming right now. And so every once in a while, you'll see that one thing that'll kind of spark that optimism that in the future, this is going to work. This is something that we've seen work. I mean, Ryan Walters took more than a few seasons to get Illinois to the point they were last year, where they were a top 5, potentially top 3 scoring defense in the country, not even just the Big Ten. And so everyone seems to be really divided on giving up, determining that Ryan Walters is second coming of a certain coach that shall not be named. But every once in a while, you just need to take that step back and realize that we are where we are, and while it's entirely reasonable to be disappointed, at the same time, you have to keep the bigger picture in mind and understand that building a program like Purdue just takes time. And especially when you have a new head coaching staff like the one we currently have, they're learning just as much along the way. Purdue's taking a risk in hiring Ryan Walters, a guy who's able to build a top 3 defense in Illinois, and say, hey, do that over here and go out and get your staff to help us compete for an ever-expanding Big Ten going forward. And unfortunately, this year is going to be one of those years. We knew it was going to be tough when Purdue had a top whatever strength of schedule. There was going to be no nights off, as we talked about plenty. And I think as the season was beginning, obviously, I think a lot of us were kind of talking ourselves into, stepping in and competing from the jump. I think this is probably a bit more of a realistic thing that we're seeing, and moving forward we can shift our expectations accordingly, and you might call it moving the goalposts, and that is what it is to a certain degree. But at the same time, obviously your expectations have to shift as things happen, and so we're going to continue on. And I know I'm excited to see them go out for Illinois. I think it's going to be a very high-strung game, obviously, with Ryan Walters' first time against his former team. And I'm glad that it is in Ross-Ade Stadium. So I'm excited to see them come out next weekend. And I think it'll be a lot of fun. But we'll talk more about the Illini in our next episode. I kind of went on a bit of a rant there. I promise this was meant to be a little bit shorter. But let's go ahead. We'll quickly take a look around the results around the rest of the Big Ten. We had a handful of conference games and a couple of notable non-conference games as well. We'll start with Michigan and Rutgers. Rutgers visiting Michigan in a clash of undefeated Big Ten East Titans. And honestly, Rutgers put up a very valiant fight in this one, obviously holding Michigan to 31 at home, scoring 7. It was actually, they were only down a touchdown going into halftime, 14-7, before Michigan kind of flexed their muscle down the stretch and held the Scarlet Knights at arm's length. But I was actually very impressed with Rutgers in this one. And obviously playing in the Big Ten East, they're going to take these kind of lumps. But I was actually very impressed with Rutgers, and I think that's nothing to be too ashamed about. And as we always know, well, I can't bet. We all know that good teams win, great teams cover. Rutgers covered the spread, and very, very solid result, even though it ended up being a 24-point loss to Michigan. I'm going to end with Ohio State Notre Dame. That was probably the Big Tennis non-conference game we could have had, with a top 10 clash at Notre Dame. But let's see. Looking elsewhere, I'll also leave Iowa and Penn State for after everything else. That was a very interesting game to follow from a very meta perspective. But let's go ahead. Illinois, Florida Atlantic. Illinois wins 23-17 over the Fightin' Owls to move to 2-2 on the year. And this was an interesting game to follow, where it looked like Illinois would be okay as the game went on, but they went down 10 early before rattling off 2 touchdowns in the second quarter, and then just kind of holding off and doing enough in the final sequence to win by, 6? So very interesting. They got pushed by Florida Atlantic at home. And this is going to be an interesting showdown in Ross-Ade next weekend. Obviously, Illinois, I think, is probably a little bit more balanced and in comparison, but I think it's going to be a very interesting matchup, and I'm excited to see it next weekend. Maryland and Michigan State. Maryland marches into East Lansing and wins 31-9. I don't think anyone's too surprised by this. Maryland has actually been very competitive this season, and while they're obviously not going to win the East, I think they'll put a scare in a couple of these, top end Big Ten East teams. And they walk into East Lansing and pretty much from tip to tail walked away with this one, and it wasn't particularly interesting outside of that. Nebraska, like I mentioned, took down Louisiana Tech 28-14. They made a change at quarterback Harburg. I'm going to go with Harburg, which is hilarious, as the quarterback actually ended up leading the team in rushing for 19 carries and 157 yards, and that dude could scoot. So that does actually, have me sweating just a little bit, but we'll see what they look like as they move into conference play as well. Indiana, the aforementioned 4 overtime game against Akron. They end up pulling this one out 29-7 in 4 overtimes. Indiana and Purdue, unfortunately, at this point, might be the 2 worst teams in the Big Ten in terms of performance, and so I put this on Twitter as well that the bucket game is going to be must-see TV from a purely sickos perspective. And honestly, let's get weird. Let's just have that kind of year. Walk out of the bucket game with a win. I think all will be forgiven in Ryan Walters' first year. And then we have also Northwestern storming back rather, to take down Minnesota in overtime, 37-34. I mean, 21 unanswered points in the fourth quarter by the Wildcats to take it to overtime before they ultimately prevail 37-34 and had all 20-something odd fans rush the field. Minnesota, like I mentioned, in an absolute free fall. Northwestern showing a little bit of fight, a little bit of life after a lot of turmoil in the offseason. And so it'll be interesting to see what they're able to do against another team that isn't, Minnesota. Thankfully, the Big Ten West is going to be an absolute Broadway show this year, and so it'll be fun to follow. Let's go ahead. Let's talk about Penn State, Iowa. Penn State wins 31-0 over Iowa. There was a lot of talk, and I think a lot of people were talking themselves into Iowa potentially taking down Penn State on the road in the whiteout game. But obviously, Iowa remembered that they scored far too many points last week against Western Michigan. And they decided to balance it out by going and put up a big old goose egg against Penn State, which I think is now ranked the #1 defense in the country. So Iowa falls for the first time this year in Happy Valley, and it really did just show the divide between the top of the Big Ten East and the top of the Big Ten West this year. That it was not pretty if you're Iowa, and Penn State just kind of did Penn State things and walked away with a 31-0 victory in the first real big clash between the 2 divisions in this final season of these divisions. So gonna be interesting to see that battle between Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan in the East. And I still think Iowa will run away with the West, the way we're currently looking up and down the order on our side of the conference. But nonetheless, it's going to be the Big Ten Westist of Big Ten West this season. And then finally, Ohio State traveled to Notre Dame and walk out with a 3-point win, scoring on the final play of the game where they were able to walk it off. And actually, this was a very, very high-level game, even though the score line really makes you think it was a Big Ten West game. Ohio State went into the half up 3-0 before a very balanced 7 points per team per quarter the rest of the way. And Ohio State leaves with a 3-point win over the Fighting Irish. I mean, this was a stressful one, as we saw a lot of very interesting play calls on both sides going down the stretch on this one, culminating in Notre Dame only putting out 10 players on defense for the final 2 plays of the game, ultimately costing them, as they just didn't put a down lineman exactly where Ohio State ended up rushing in for the final score in this one. Ohio State does us proud, takes down the Irish, and hands the Big Ten probably their biggest win of the season so far, 17-14. So very interesting weekend of games. We'll cover next weekend's games in our next episode, but there are going to be some very fascinating games in this one as well. I'm excited to see what it will become of it. There's either going to be blood or there's just going to be the most chalkiest of games that we've ever seen. But guys, that will wrap it up for me here. If you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead, hit subscribe, leave a comment down below what you thought of the Wisconsin game. Obviously, be nice. We are all friends here. And if you're listening to this on the audio only version, go ahead, leave a rating, follow this stream, and we'll continue pumping out these and continue to get better as we try and make our way forward this year. It's going to be a long year, but I'm excited to see where it takes us in the long run. So as always, guys, this has been Dakota or Boiler in Texas on all social media platforms. We'll be back in a few days to talk about Illinois and the next week's slate of Big Ten games. That'll do it for me here. And as always, Boiler up, hammer down, hail Purdue.